I am going to record this webinar so that we can share it out with you as well after it's over. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and there is a slide deck. And as I mentioned earlier, I have given you access to be able to speak. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask questions, please feel free to do that. We can have some dialogue. That way it doesn't have to just be me presenting slides. And so, yeah, please feel free to do that. I'm going to share my screen here and start the slideshow. Okay. As I mentioned, this is the TRIO SSS Grant Writing 101. It is designed for those new to SSS, institutions who don't have SSS but want to write one, new directors who just took over an SSS program. And so, it will be very much high-level information. Today's agenda, I'll give a quick intro of myself. We already did some housekeeping items, little mood meter, icebreaker kind of thing, who's in the room, high-level info, nuts and bolts, grant sections, odds and ends, and then sort of a Q&A, and then I'll send out an evaluation after. Well, let me just introduce myself. I'm Heath Alexander. I'm the Senior Director of the Grants and Evaluation Division of Study Smart Tutors, and I have a long history in TRIO programs. I was a participant in Talent Search, came from a single parent home, first gen low income, only person in my family to attend college. When I attended Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I became a summer camp counselor for Upper Bound, and eventually earned my degree in biology and chemistry, a teacher certification, and a master's in educational leadership. And I began working at Grand Valley State University as a teacher coordinator for Upper Bound and eventually to the director. In 2008, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I currently still reside, even though I'm in Long Beach right now, conducting some work. I worked at the Council for Opportunity in Education from 2008 to 2015. And during that time, I was a presenter for and faculty member of their proposal writing workshops for various TRIO programs, where I taught some of these sections as well as helped critique grant sections that attendees would bring to our sessions. And then also in the 2008 reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, Congress provided for an appeals process in law, and later in 2010, the Department of Education published regulations to discuss how that appeals process would unfold. And at the time, I believe I was the only former practitioner other than Arnold Mitchum and Maureen Hoyler to work at the council. And so I was tasked with helping to read some of the grant applications and helping to read the readers' comments and help draft letters to the department on behalf of our members who wanted to appeal the decision that they were not funded. And so over the course of several years, part of my job was to read hundreds of grant applications and thousands of readers' comments across the country over every TRIO program. And so over that time period, I really was able to sort of understand better how these grant applications were scored by the Department of Education, and sort of see some of the patterns and consistencies on how certain things were scored. And so that kind of gives me a bit of an advantage when helping our clients write these grants or edit them or review them, or all the other services that we provide. And so I have a long history in TRIO as a student, as a practitioner, as an advocate in DC, and of course, sort of liaison with the Department of Ed in the field, and how to understand the grant process. So that's my background, and a bit about why, I have an expertise to present this topic and why I have so much passion about it as well. We always, at Study Smart Tutors, we always like to start out with various icebreakers, and there's tons of them that we have that I really like, but this one is a fun one for webinars because I like how, the visual of it, the different colors, and just gives everybody a chance to, kind of ease into the presentation. So it's not just, dense content, but, just to give a sense of how everyone's feeling It's summertime. It's hot in lots of places. The summer programs, a lot of summer programs are over. We're getting ready for fall. So with this one, I'd love it if you all could just take a look at, the Q1, which is yellow, energetic, cheerful, hyper. Red, typically associated with anger, blowing off your top and all that kind of stuff. Blue, sad, bored, sort of lonely, depressed, hopeless, despair, all those kinds of blue feelings. And then green is sort of chill, relaxed, grateful, fulfilled, content. You could be somewhere in the middle of a couple of these different quadrants as well, but I'd love to, just get a sense of the audience and how you all feel, on this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're located. So go ahead and use the chat box and just tell me how you feel. You can use a color, you can use a word, you can use the quadrant. Yeah, so go ahead and take some time to do that now, and we'll finish up the icebreaker. I went ahead and modeled for you sort of how you could also do it. Again, there's various ways that you can interact with this icebreaker. A little combination of Qs 1 and 4. Yeah, that's usually where I am, Kelsey. Typically fall in those. Oh, great. Pleasant and motivated. I like that, Gina. Awesome, Stephen. Oh, you started already. Okay. Okay. Lots of greens and yellows. Starting to become a little worried. Mostly green. Yeah. Usually the beginning of the semesters are usually, typically optimistic with a little bit of, worry and stress, but, fresh start for everybody. So hopefully most people are feeling somewhat energetic and optimistic about the semester. Excellent. Well, thank you guys, everyone who shared. It's okay how you're feeling. Hopefully, by the end of the session, hopefully everybody will be feeling more at ease, sort of more relaxed about the grant writing process. So also I'd love to just hear from you all to get a better sense of, what your current position is. If you don't mind, you can unmute yourself, you can put it in the chat box, however you feel like interacting, but I'd love to hear from everyone to find out, do you currently work for an SSS program? Do you have experience in writing this grant? Sort of what is your overall, position and expertise on grant writing? That'll give me a sense of how, how deep to go into this, or how, sort of high level to keep it. So just tell me what, yeah. So yeah, excellent. Second time going through, good. Director for 2 years. So Tanya, you've not written this grant before, I take it, since you've only been a director for 2 years. Same with probably Jesse. Okay, excellent. Okay. First time grant writer, second time grant writer. Okay. Excellent. No writing experience. Oh, great. SSS alum. That's awesome. First time preparing to write. Okay. Excellent. Oh, great, Susan. That's awesome. Okay, good. So I got a sense that most of you are, this will be your first time. A couple of you maybe your second time. Even if it's your second time, it's been, almost 4 years since we had to submit them. So it'd be good to get a little refresher as well. So let me just talk a little bit about we usually call it RFP process. Some people call it NIA process, but RFP just requests for proposals. How does it work at the department level? And what can you expect in terms of the timing of this grant or the rollout of it? Usually, if you think about the bottom of the pyramid here and moving up towards the tip, I know that's sort of reverse of how usually we use these pyramids, but think about it from the broad perspective, right? Just this big funnel. The draft RFP sort of starts the whole process. And what happens is the Department of Education will release a draft of the NIA or draft of the instructions, and then they give a 30-day comment period for the public to read through it and comment in the register to sort of, get everyone's take on what they think about the instructions. Now, in the past 3 or 4 trio competitions, the current administration has really been sort of circumventing this process. And what I mean by that is they've not really been releasing a real draft. In fact, what they've mostly been publishing is just the final request for proposals from 4 or 5 years ago for each of the competitions, with almost nothing changed in it. And so the draft really doesn't give you any indication of what the future final RFP might look like. And they do this because the 30-day comment period is a requirement. And instead of actually producing a real draft that gets all these signatures on it and takes the 30-day comment period seriously, where they really want feedback from the community, they just publish the old RFP, and and the comments are basically useless because we don't know what any new things that might be in there. We don't know the budget amount. We don't know any competitive preference parties that might be in there. We don't know any absolute parties that might be in there, invitational parties. There's a lot of things that they can add to these competitions that we have no insight on when they just publish an old one from 5 years ago. In fact, there's quite a bit of things that are being added to these competitions now that are not outlined in our federal regulations. And so it is a bit concerning that we're a bit blind on those things during this comment period. But most of the selection criteria, well, all of the selection criteria that's outlined in the federal regulations will be in the competition. So we know at least part of what the selection criteria will be because they're based in the federal regulations, they have to include them in the RFP. However, while the department cannot eliminate anything from the selection criteria, they can actually add to it. They can add entirely new sections. They can add all these priorities. And so, we still don't need to wait for these RFPs to come out to start working on the grant, because we know the selection criteria that has been unchanged since 2010. So the draft will come out. They'll give a 30-day comment period. Once that 30-day comment period is over with, then they usually take anywhere from 30 to even 90 days sometimes before they release a final RFP. And then once the final RFP is released, they'll give you the due date on the application instructions and in the Federal Register. And that due date is typically anywhere from 30 to 60 days. In the past few trio competitions, we've seen 45 days, we've seen 60 days in some other federal grants. With student support services, I'm not sure what they're going to offer us, but you should get at least 30 days minimum. But again, you do not need to wait for the final RFP or even the draft RFP to come out to get started in writing your grant. And that's why we're doing this webinar a year early, because you can actually start now based on what we already know. So what we do think is that, the due date will likely be sometime between November 24th and November 2024 and February 2025. In the previous SSS competition, the due date was Monday, January 27th, 2020. That doesn't mean that will be the due date. It could be as early as November. Many of these applications have been delayed over the past few years, a lot of that due to COVID and some other responsibilities that the department had in terms of having difficulty of getting these competitions going. They do need to have a competition next year because all of the SSS grants are on a 5-year cycle, and they will all be expiring at the end of that 2025 year. And so We do know that they will have as long as Congress continues to fund these programs through their appropriations, we know that there'll be a competition around this time. And so you have roughly, let's call it, 14 to maybe 18 months or so to work on your application. We can expect there to be competitive preference priorities and some kind of logic model or quality of project design. And again, in the past, these sections have been added as a selection criteria as quality of project design, or they will ask for it in a competitive preference priority. So we don't know where it will be, but we can expect there to be some kind of requirement that you'll have to produce a logic model. And in the logic model, you're basically, the basic logic model for these applications really is just, some kind of inputs and outputs, some kind of short, middle, and long-term goals for your project, including your objectives. And what they've been asking for is that you select one of the activities that you plan to do in your grant, and you tie it to a study that shows that there has been some level of effectiveness of that particular intervention. And in the past, it's only had to be one of those activities that's in your logic model, then is being used to connect to some kind of research study. How can we write the grant now if we don't have any RFP or due date? As I mentioned in the opening, the selection criteria for how the secretary scores these applications is outlined in the SSS federal regulations. And so I'm going to actually go through that selection criteria today. And again, that selection criteria will be in the application. So we can start on it right now. If you want copies of the federal regulations, the law, EDGAR, OMB guidance to better understand what this grant is, how it needs to run, what the selection criteria is, what are the required services, all of those things can be found in these links, which I'll share out this presentation at the end of the webinar. And so these are hyperlinked, and so it should take you right to the Department of Ed website for each of these documents. Quick poll question. And you can do this in the chat. How many SSS grants may an institution write in this competition? Give me your best guess. Is it one? Is it more than one? Or any number between, let's say, 1 and 10? Okay. Okay. Good guesses. So in fact, with the Student Support Services Program, you are allowed to write for any of these special populations, including the regular SSS program, on any campus and any branch campus. So if you had 3 branch campuses, you could write 18 applications because there are 6 different populations. Well, let me back up. In the last competition, these were the populations that you could address in your SSS grant. You could write a regular SSS grant with 140 students minimum. You could run an SSS program for students with disabilities for 100 students, English as a second language for 140, a STEM program for 120, SSS teacher prep for 140, and SSS for veterans at 120. And so you can actually write one application for each of these populations at every institution and every branch campus. Now, the Department of Education does not have to have a competition for all of these populations because that is not outlined in federal regulation. But the federal regulation does say that there will be some additional populations in the competitions. And they have changed over the years. Like, for example, there used to be one on health science, and I think they rolled it into the STEM grant. But you can actually write for all of these. And if you currently have a student support services program and you want to write for additional programs, the selection criteria is the same for all of them. And so we can help you with thinking through some differences and what the data might look like for those grants. But you can use the same you can clone the SSS grant application that you're already working on or that you already have, and you can just put in some additional data for these special populations, and you can rework your plan of operation. You can rework some of your project management and your staffing to fit some of the needs of these populations. But everything is the same virtually for all of these applications, other than likely just the data, the objectives that you're going to write, and your plan of operation. So the answer really is more than one, but there's no specific answer for every institution, because it will be dependent upon your situation, right? If you have branch campuses, obviously you can be eligible for each of these 6 at every branch campus. One of the partners I work with in writing grants over the years actually has 9 SSS grants on their campus and their branch campuses. That's the most that I'm aware of, but there may be some that have additional ones. So who is eligible to apply for an SSS grant? In the Code of Federal Regulations 646.2, it says that only institutions of higher education may apply, or a combination of institutions. And so, where would that, when would a sort of a combination of institutions be applicable? Really it could be any situation, but it could be situations where there are already agreements between institutions. It could be maybe a smaller institution that doesn't have a larger population, but, thinks that maybe they won't be able to qualify. I personally am not aware of any SSS grant that is a collaboration between 2 institutions, although I do remember reviewing a grant in the past that was specifically for veterans, and there was a collaboration with other institutions in that particular application. What is the selection criteria? The selection criteria, if you've worked in any TRIO program, not just SSS, you probably recognize these. In 646.21, it outlines that the selection criteria currently is the needs section, objectives, plan of operation, institutional commitment, quality of personnel, budget, and evaluation plan. And we're going to go through each of those sections today. In the past, there was an additional section added called quality of project design. That may or may not be included in this competition. What the department did with this quality of project design section was they rolled it into the competitive preference priorities in other TRIO competitions. We also do expect some kind of competitive preference priorities. We're not really sure what they are yet, although I have worked on some other grants recently, and so I have some ideas of what it could be, but there's no time to speculate right now. You can wait to work on those competitive preference priorities after the RFP comes out. Right now, what we do know is that these 7 selection criteria will be in there, and so it's probably better to work on those and worry about the competitive preference priorities later. Are there any questions about this slide? Again, we're going to go into each section in more detail, but I just always want to check and make sure if there's any pressing questions you have. Please, feel free to use the chat. You can also unmute yourself and, at any time and interrupt. So moving to the needs section, the needs section is worth 24 points. And not just because it's worth 24 points that it's important, it's because the needs section really sets the tone, tells the story, and sets up your data section so that you can write other sections of your grant application. If you do not nail this section, you're very likely not going to get funded, because you're not going to, not only will you miss points on the needs section, but you're very likely to lose points on the objectives, because the objective section is written based on primarily the data that you're going to be outlining in your needs section. And when I was at COE and I was conducting the appeal process, this is not empirical data, but I can tell you about 99% of the applications that we read in the appeals that did not get funded and wanted to appeal lost points in the objective section. And it's because they wrote the objectives wrong and they did not include the data necessary in the needs section that would allow them to be successful in the objective section. And so again, if you don't outline the right data here, your objectives are going to be off as well. That's a sure way to not get funded. And so if I haven't scared you enough about this section, I'll just reiterate, this is you've got to nail the needs section. This is the most important. And there really are only 3 sections of the need. The first is they want a high number or a high percentage of eligible students at your institution. That's low income, first gen, and disabled students. And if there are other special populations, you would also include them as well. But for just for generally speaking, the eligible population would be low income, first gen, and disabled. Most institutions will outline low income only students, first generation only students, students with disabilities only, and then some combinations, low income and first generation, low income and disabled, and they will make them all unduplicated numbers. And so the goal here in section 1 is to tell the reader that your institution has a high enough population that you could reasonably serve 140 students in a regular SSS grant, or as you saw from the previous slide, any other number of students based in those special populations. And so the goal is to say to them, we have enough students that would qualify for this program that we reasonably believe we could fill all the slots that we need to manage our program on an annual basis. And they ask for a percentage because they're also looking for how high of a need does your institution have overall for an SSS grant. So unlike other sections of the grant, the needs section is the section where you're trying to convince the reader that the Department of Ed really needs to fund this grant. Otherwise, your students are going to continue to struggle. They're already struggling. They already have a high need. So this is not an opportunity to brag about all the great things your institution's already doing, how awesome your students are performing, how you have all the resources in the world to support them. This is the section where you get to say, woe is me. If we don't get this grant, we're in big trouble, right? Maybe not that extreme, but the goal here is to outline why you need this grant on your campus. Okay, so the tone of it should be, hey, we have some deficits here. We've got some gaps in outcomes for the low-income, first-gen disabled populations, and we really need the resources and the services of this grant to help catch them up with other populations. All right, that's the entire tone of this section. Section 2 is very open-ended. It says academic and other problems that students on your campus encounter. And this is an opportunity in an open-ended section for you to be very specific and to let the reader know how knowledgeable you are about your campus climate, culture, barriers that students are facing. And it should not look like everybody else's grant, because your campus and your students and the issues they have may look different than other people. And so, other campuses, I should say. So what I always encourage people to put in here is some academic factors that students are encountering, some social or social emotional factors, and financial. And I typically recommend people to put in about 5 to 7 different problems that students encounter, including these 3 items. And you should try to include all 3. If you don't, you very likely could lose a point on this section if you don't include all 3, and if you don't have at least 5 to 7 different items. One of those items I recommend to be the percentage of students who are in good academic standing. Every campus can decide what good academic standing definition looks like for your particular school, for students who are meeting satisfactory academic progress. Most of the time, and for many institutions, that tends to be a 2.0 GPA or above to be considered a good academic standing. Now, at your institution, you may have different tiers of good academic standing or GPAs that would put you into these categories. And so for that one, I would recommend just pulling multiple data sets for all the different categories and seeing which of them seems to stand out in terms of the gaps that exist for low-income and first-gen students. Why am I specifically targeting good academic standing? It's because the need section does not ask you for that. It asks you for GPA, but it does not specifically ask you for good academic standing. And as it turns out, one of the objectives includes the percentage of students who are in good academic standing. If you only include the average GPAs of students on your campus, let's say the average GPA of low-income students compared to the average GPA of non-low-income students, you do need to include that information because they're asking for it. However, that is not the correct baseline for the objective. The correct baseline for the objective is to be in good academic standing, which is different than the average GPAs. And so because they don't ask for it in the needs section, and because it is an objective that you have to write, you need to volunteer that data here in the needs section so that you can then have a baseline to use for your objective section. I'm getting a little ahead of myself on how to write objectives, but I'm trying to explain why I'm specifically outlining good standing here or good academic standing as opposed to any of the other things that you could be including. All right. So again, part 2 is open-ended. They just say, tell us everything that's wrong, all the problems that the students on your campus face, let me know what they are. And so there's nothing specific you have to put. My recommendation is to put these 3 items and to do, like I said, 5 to 7, including good academic standing. Number 3 is really, to paraphrase what this section is that you're comparing students on your campus who would be eligible to participate in your SSS program versus some other comparison group. And the comparison group is typically non-eligible students, right? So if it's first-gen low-income students as your eligible population, you want to select a comparison group that are likely not first-gen and not low-income students. And they want you to compare the data for those students on retention, graduation, GPA, graduate school enrollment if you're a 4 institution, and the students who are transferring from 2-year schools to 4-year schools if you're a 2-year institution. So you have to have data points from your institution. All right. And so your institution IR team can help you pull this data, and you're not comparing your students to other campuses. You're not comparing your students to national averages. You're really trying to compare your students eligible to non-eligible students. All right. Some overview and tips of this section. Identify data to represent the student needs on your campus. Sorry, I'm really sorry about this chat. Again, I'm using someone else's computer and I don't know how to disable it. I really apologize. Identify data to represent the student needs on your campus. I mentioned there are only 3 sections. The data here is used as the baseline for the objectives in the objective section, which we'll cover next, and to outline the problems that you plan to address in your plan of operation. You use recent data and include comparison data for all the data that you include. What does recent mean? Recent means for the Department of Ed, they say the most recent data available. You know, there's been a lot of issues with getting accurate data over the last few years because of the pandemic, but ultimately you're going to be submitting this in late 2024 or early 2025. You can start figuring out what the data set looks like now, and then you can pull a refreshed data set next summer as well to get the 23-24 data if you'd like to, but it has to be at least within the last 3 years. So recent would be most recent data available and not older than 3 years. All right. Use tables or charts and graphs to explain the data. It's easier for the readers to make out what you're trying to say, as opposed to putting everything in paragraphs and having it be several pages long. You really want to be very succinct here. You're not writing a dissertation. You're trying to answer the questions and earn the points that they're going to be scoring you on. And so you want to, as easily as possible, show the readers where the information is. You want to be a friend to the reader. You don't want them to spend an hour on your needs section. You want them to be able to find the information very quickly and to give you the points as quickly as possible. And so that's why I think tables and charts and graphs make a lot of sense. And just as long as they're labeled clearly, and you can definitely write a paragraph explaining and you probably should write a paragraph explaining the charts or graphs that you use, but they should be very intuitive to read. If you write if you have a table or a chart or graph, please ask someone who doesn't know your program well to read it and see if they can understand what you're trying to represent in those diagrams, okay? Here would be an example of, a table. You're going to talk about the population, eligible, non-eligible, the difference between them. You're going to outline the baselines for each of your objectives. We're going to talk more about that in the objective section. But when I represent data in the needs section that ends up being the baseline for my specific objective, I always label it. I want to tell the reader, where can you find the baseline information? Because my objective is going to be written on this. I don't want to leave it up to the reader to try to figure out or guess what baselines I'm going to be using for my objectives. And so I always label them in the tables or even in the paragraphs, and to set myself up for a transition to the next section. You want to put the source of the data. Do not include current or past participant data, and use data that's 3 years or less, most recent data available. I'm going to cover this, do not include current or past participant data in the objective section. So hold me to that because that's very important. And that's a good way to lose points on your objectives. And I'm going to explain that in a second. I think that's it for the needs section. So let me, no, this is the last slide. So with the needs section, use your IR office or any other data source on your campus. You're not using national data sets to compare. You can use National Student Clearinghouse for like graduate school enrollment and things like that, for some of the data as well. But most of the data should come from your campus research team, your campus's data office, whatever you call it on your campus, because all of the data that you're putting in here is going to be based on your students on your campus, okay? So let me stop there and see if there are any questions about the needs section. Again, it's the most important section, so I want to take as much time to answer your questions as I can. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question or put it in the chat box. Don't be shy. And also, hopefully I covered it very well, but I don't think I covered everything perfectly. So if you have a question, please, for the good of the group, definitely take time to ask it now, or you can save it till the end as well. Okay. Seeing no questions, again, you can put it in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we can get to it later as well if you think of something as we're going through the other sections. The objective section is only worth 8 points. However, this is the section, again, where I see people miss points the most. And if you miss points here, not you personally, but if people tend to miss points here, they tend to miss all of them. And the reason why they miss all of them is because they just don't write them correctly. And so I want to talk about how do you write them correctly today so that you don't make that mistake. There really are only 3 objectives, and there are 4 objectives if you are at a 2-year institution, and I'll explain that. The first objective is the percentage of your students who would be in your program after you recruit them, who will be retained from one academic year to the next. And so it's just a general retention percentage. The only way you can write this objective is if you know what the retention rate of your students is in the past, based on the data set that you pull. And so the goal here is to look at last year's data that shows the retention rate of eligible students, first-gen low-income disabled students, and then to propose a higher retention rate than what they're currently doing, they're currently achieving. So the goal here is to say low-income first-gen students, I'll throw a number out there, their retention rate in their first-year retention rate or second-year retention rate is, let's say 75%. We're going to propose an 85% or a 90% retention rate of our students, right? So you're looking at creating a baseline, right? You're looking at creating a retention baseline. Eligible students are currently performing at 65%. We're going to then, on our objective, propose a higher percentage than what that baseline number shows us. The same with good academic standing. It's the percentage of students who will be in good academic standing during that academic year. And we're going to propose a higher percentage than what the current students' good academic standing rate is from the previous data set. Objective number 3, if you're at a 4-year institution, it's the percentage of students who will earn a baccalaureate degree within 6 years. If you're at a 2-year institution, it's a certificate or degree completion within 3 years. And the 2-year institutions actually have a second, we'll call it a 3B objective, which is completion and transfer. It's the percentage of students who will earn an associate's degree and then transfer to a 4-year institution. Now, this one sort of catches people up because it's important to note that you only get credit if they earn an associate's degree and then transfer. You don't get credit if they transfer before earning the degree. And if you're at a 2-year institution, you know that's very specific because some students will transfer after they meet some kind of transfer agreement. Sometimes it's 60 credits. Sometimes there's a transfer agreement between 2- and 4-year schools that they meet. And it doesn't mean they earn their associates. They're just prepared to transfer to the 4-year institution. With this specific grant, they have to earn a degree and then transfer. And so that's what this objective is about. The reason why I'm spending more time on this one is because this is most often the one that gets messed up in the needs section as well as the objectives. And it's also what I find is some 2-year institutions are not tracking this data point very well. They're tracking transfer rates or completion rates, but they're not always tracking what percentage of students actually completed and then transferred. And so they're putting all different kinds of random data sets that do not include this exact data point. And so if you're going to set a baseline, again, if you're going to set a baseline of graduation and transfer here, you have to make sure that it is specific to students who get an associate's and then transfer, because that's the real baseline for this objective. And then, of course, you're going to propose something to be higher. So those are the 4 objectives if you're a 2-year school. Some of the overview and tips for this section. The objectives must be what they call in the application as ambitious and attainable. The only way the objective can be scored as ambitious is that it rises above the baseline number that you're representing in the needs section. You have a retention rate for last year for eligible students. You're going to be ambitiously proposing something higher than that. That's the only information you need to put. That's the only way you can score ambitiously on the grant, is to be higher than a baseline number. The only way it can be attainable is that you outline how that objective will be attainable in your plan of operation. And so in the objective section, you're going to say here that this objective is attainable because we're going to provide these 5 services to ensure it will be attainable. All right, we're going to, for good academic standing, we're going to provide tutoring. We're going to assist students with course selection. We're going to help them with financial aid to make sure they don't work 50 hours a week and fail their classes, right? What are you going to do to make sure that these students will be in good academic standing? That's what you're going to put for attainable. The readers are required to make sure that every objective meets both of those criteria. You don't get partial credit for one and not the other. So if it's ambitious, but they don't feel you can actually attain it, you get 0. Meaning if you put your retention rate is going to be 100%, they're going to say, I don't think you're going to get 100% of your students to be retained. Therefore, while that sounds very ambitious to me, 100% is ambitious, we don't believe that's attainable. You're going to get 0 points. Okay, so it has to be both of those things simultaneously. It's an all or none situation. And that's why most grants that I see where they lose points on this section typically lose all 8 points, because they're just not writing it correctly. They don't have a proper baseline. They're not using that baseline to be ambitious, or they don't talk about how they're actually going to attain it. They just put a random number in there. Baseline data is the only data to use for setting the percentages. And what I'm saying here is, one mistake I see people make is, or institutions make, I should say, is that they include a whole bunch of different data points. And they say, well, this retention rate is ambitious because, students, have a low income, and students' GPA is low, and, they have gaps in financial aid, right? They start putting all of this data in there. And the reader, they can get confused. They don't know what percentage you're supposed to be using for your baseline. You're supposed to come up with one baseline number, and they're inundating the reader with several data points, and the reader's having a very hard time figuring out, well, what is your actual baseline here? And so the only data you really need to include is the actual, if you're using objective 1, the only data point you need is the percentage of students eligible last year who were retained. And so that's your actual baseline, and you need to label it. You need to tell the reader, this is our baseline. This is why we're writing the objective the way we are. And that way you'll be safe. You don't need to repeat all the other data points from your needs section, just that one baseline. How it's attainable is your plan of operation services. You can say, we're going to have a highly qualified staff. We're going to have a reasonable budget to execute on the services. We have institutional support, right? You can include those 4 things to also make it attainable, not just the services, right? You can say services, staff, budget, and institutional support. I like to include all of those things to make it attainable. And then finally, these objectives are standard for all programs, and they're found on the program profile sheet within your application instructions. What does standard for all programs mean? It means that everybody who writes this grant is going to write word for word, copy and pasted from this program profile sheet, each of these 3 or 4 objectives, right? So every program in the country should have the exact same words in their objectives. The only thing that will change is the percentage that they put in there. All right, so they're standard. If you've worked on these grants before in other TRIO programs, it's the same, right? All the TRIO programs have standardized objectives. Okay, so I'll stop there and see, are there any questions? Was I confusing about any of this stuff, or anything you'd like to hear more about? Any questions about the objective section? Okay, Ivana, what do you have?
Question. I just want to make sure that I heard this correctly. So when you were talking about the objectives, you said that the baseline is the percentage of students who were retained the year prior. When you say that, do you mean all of the SSS eligible students?
That's right.
Okay.
When you're outlining this on the needs section, let's take retention as the example. What you're representing in the needs section is all the eligible students on your campus, first gen, low income, disabled, whatever like target population you have for this program, right? You're outlining your target population, and that's your eligible students. And so you want to find data, I'm sorry, excuse me. You want to find data on eligible students on your campus. What is their retention rate? And then you're going to set an objective that's specific to the SSS students that you'll recruit from this targeted population. Okay, so you're saying our institution's retention rate for eligible students is this. We're going to recruit out of that pool of eligible students, 140 students, and then we're going to increase their retention rate higher than what the institution is currently performing at. Does that answer your question?
I think I'm more confused now.
Okay, let me try it a different way.
Okay.
So you're getting ready to write this needs section. And you have to talk to your IR team and you have to say, can you please give me data that tells me what is the retention rate of the low income first gen disabled students on my campus, right? Anyone who's eligible to participate in an SSS program, what is their retention rate? All right. And that's what you're going to put here as your baseline. And then when you get to the objective section, you're going to say, all of the eligible students on our campus retention rate is 65%. For SSS students, we're going to propose their retention rate is going to be higher than what the eligible students had performed in the past. And we're going to make it 75% or 80%, right? So you're proposing to increase the retention rate of SSS students as compared to all the other eligible students that performed in whatever data set you've chosen. Does that make sense?
Yes, that the second time around was good. Okay, thank you.
Yep, and you're going to do that same model for all of them, right? You're saying eligible students are performing at this rate. Our SS kids are going to blow that out of the water, right? We're going to do better than, we're going to increase their outcome. All right, any other questions? Thanks for asking that question. Anyone else have a question? And again, that question may have cleared something up for someone else. So, please, for the good of the group, if you have questions, now's the best time to do it. I mean, the needs section and the objective section are inextricably linked together. You have to write them in unison. It's not random. You don't just put a random percentage in here. You don't say, you know what, I think we could get 85%. Well, if the institutional retention rate is 82%, then 85 is not very ambitious, right? So you can't just choose any percentage you think. It's got to be based on the data from your institution, or you can't write it correctly. Remember earlier I said, you also do not want to use the SSS data from your campus because number one, those students should be performing better because they've been receiving services already, right? And so it's not a good data set for you to use. In fact, you may ask your IR team if they're able to take out SSS students from the eligible data set that you're using because that will skew your data because those students should be performing better. So that's the first reason not to use it. The second reason is if you tell the reader that 80% of our SSS students have been in good academic standing over the last 5 years, we're going to make it 90%. They could very well say, well, you've already proven over the last 5 years, you can only get to 80%. Now you're telling me you're going to get to 90%. That does not seem attainable to me, right? You're telling me now that you're going to do 10% better, 10 percentage points better than what you've been able to do the last 5 years. That doesn't make sense, right? If you say, it's 80% and, we're going to set it at 75% because there's different circumstances going on, they're going to say, well, that doesn't sound very ambitious because you already told us you could get to 80%. Why are you now setting it at 75%, right? And so either of those scenarios will hurt you if you're including SSS data, in your data set. And the reason why I mention this is because I've actually seen this happen. I've actually seen readers write these comments on grant applications because they included their current SSS students. And in one case they put, that the baseline for retention, I want to say it was like 62% for SSS students, and they were going to increase it to like 67%. It was like a 5 percentage point increase. And the reader said, well, that doesn't sound like a very good increase. It's only 5% percentage points difference. And so they took points off for that. If let's say your good academic standing rate was 80 and you just put 80 again, because you said, oh, well, we know we can get 80 because we've always gotten that. Again, you're setting the reader up to be able to say, wait a minute, you got 80 before. Why are you not trying to do better the next 5 years? Didn't you learn anything from the past 5 years? Can't you do better than you did before? So there's no scenario in which you, including your SSS students' past performance, that's going to benefit you on this section. So do not include it. Only include the general population of would-be eligible SSS students. You only use their data. Do not use your SSS data. Okay. I can't stress that enough because I've seen it hurt people many times. Any other questions about the objective section? again, while the needs section is the most important because it sets you up, the objective section is the section where I see most people lose points. So please feel free to ask questions on either of those two before we move on. Ivana, again, I think I saw.
Yep, sorry.
No
So
problem.
because you really talked about, at least hammered home, at least to me, like, you know, it has to be ambitious, it has to be attainable. So like, and I'm just gonna use my institution for example. So like, say if our baseline, you know, like retention rate is like, which I think currently it's like 72%.
Mhm.
Okay, great. So it's like, okay, how would you say, I guess for a person writing this, what is a good, like clearly, like I can't do like a 10% jump, right? Like it can't be 82, but like, what is like a good, like in between where it's like, okay, yes, this is ambitious, yes, it's attainable, it's not somewhere out in la la land. Like, how does one, like, I know I'm probably asking the most impossible question, but how does one assess, like, this is something that's, you know, ambitious, it's attainable, we can do this without having whoever's going to be on the other back end of this say like,
Sure.
oh, you can't, like, what is there a formula to follow by? Like, how are we
Yeah.
doing?
No, I'm glad you asked that question because that's the question that everyone always asks. And it is an impossible question without knowing more information, right? And every objective will be a little bit different, right? And it also depends on your baseline. What I tell people to do is look at the baseline number. Let's say it's 62%, or I'm sorry, you said 72. You're going to look at the baseline number. You're going to look at the comparison group number as well, right? And so you've got your baseline is, you know, 72% for low-income first-gen students. What is it for the non-eligible population? Is it 82? Is it 80? Is it 85? You know, what is the non-eligible looking like? And then you do want to look at your APR data because you do want to see, well, what have we been able to accomplish in the past? Because you don't want to set it well above that either, right? Because you don't want to set it at a rate that you don't think you can reasonably achieve. So you want to look at those three data points and try to make a good decision about something in the sweet spot, right? What did eligible students perform at? We should be able to increase the we should be able to increase what students are performing at by giving them these extra services. That's the whole point of this grant, right? You should be trying to help level the playing field a little bit to get them closer to the non-eligible population, but you don't want to set it so high that it's above that number either, because that may be seen as not attainable. And you want to confer your past performance because you don't want to set it higher than that. And so those are three data points you want to look at before setting the number. We typically do try to tell people as a rule of thumb to set your objective close to, it's possible, close to, 10 percentage points higher than your baseline. So if it was 72, we would likely say 80 to 82 will keep you in the range of being ambitious. Now, again, that depends on what the baseline is, right? If it's 90%, you can't go to 100%. That would be 10 percentage points higher, right? And so that's why it's impossible without knowing all of those different data points, what exactly an ambitious would be. So we have to look at each one of them individually based on those data points and based on, other factors that are included in your grant application. But that's what we do as consultants, is try to help you figure out what that number will be. At the end of the day, though, these are human beings reading your application, and they can take any liberty they want on their professional judgment. We have seen readers, if you put, 10, 15 percentage points higher, saying that's not ambitious enough, where another reader might say that's too ambitious. So you can't mitigate the risk of human error or human judgment or human opinion on these applications. So that's why you have to write it the best you can in terms of the data that you have at your institution and based on your past performance. And so, yeah, it is an impossible question to answer, but that's, the way I answered it is the only way to answer it, really. That's the only answer to give, is it depends on, what the data tells us. You may have one data point, maybe your completion and transfer rate is sub 10%, right? I've seen lots of institutions that have less than 10% of their students who get an associate's degree and then transfer to a four-year school. And so obviously the increase over that can be much higher than if your baseline is 85%, right? If your baseline is 8%, you could easily go to 20% or something like that, versus if it's 85%, you don't want to go to 98%, right? And so it also depends on that baseline as well. Wendy asks, do you state in the application that you have taken the currently served SSS students out of the data set? Yes, you would say these are eligible non-served students. So yeah, Ivana, I'll be happy also offline to, again, we do this as consultants as a part of our job, but happy to sort of take a look at some of those things with you offline if you just wanted to, have a quick call too. But that is that's the impossible question to answer. But that's also, where our expertise comes in, right? That's why we've been very successful at getting these grants. Last competition, we had 100% of our SSS grants get renewed, and we were able to get over 70% of our new applicants who are writing new SSS grants for the first time also to get funded. And so we have an expertise specifically on helping to write these objectives. So we'll move on to the plan of operations for the sake of time. Really, the plan of operation is how you plan to manage your grant from the moment you get your grant, how you're going to inform your institutional community about the services that you're going to provide and the objectives that you have, how you're going to identify, select, and retain your participants, how you're going to assess their need once they become a participant and monitor their progress. What services are you going to provide specifically to address the objectives of your project? And then what is the administration of your project going to look like? Where's going to be placed in the overall structure of your institution, the time and effort of key personnel, and how you're going to manage your financial personnel and your student records. And so the plan of operation, this is where you get to set yourself apart from other applicants by having a very robust plan to operate your program. Some overall tips include the readers want an actual plan, not some kind of statement. They take the word plan very seriously. And your plan should include the who's, the what's, the when's, the how's, the why's. All of those questions need to be answered, right? You can't just say we're going to do this. You've got to say, when are you going to do it? How often, right? The frequency, who's going to execute on it? What objective is it tied to, right? When you think about a plan, you want it to be a well thought out, process, not just, a statement of this is something that we're expecting to do. Don't take the process or the words for granted, right? The readers do not know your program. And what I mean by this is I'll talk to clients and I'll say, I don't see anything in here, about recruiting students during freshman orientation. Oh yeah, we do that. That's the biggest way we find students is we go to orientation, we set up a table. Well, why didn't you say that in your application, right? And so, that's a simple example, but it's an example to underscore the idea that think through your process and think through what would someone need to know how to run this grant if they didn't know anything about you, right? They could just pull your grant off the shelf and they could execute on their grant because they can see, sort of how the process works. So don't take anything for granted, because you also might be leaving out something that's really important that makes your program stronger than others. You want to address your objectives where possible, right? Any activities you do, you should be able to say this activity is tied back to retention. This activity is tied back to helping students increase their good academic standing, or this, activity helps students to graduate on time or transfer, those kinds of things. This is where you develop your service delivery model. And your service delivery model should include all of the required services that are outlined in the federal regulations. And we also recommend a scoring rubric for the identifying and selecting of your participants. You will not find that anywhere in the RFP or anywhere in the selection criteria, but I can tell you, if you don't put a scoring rubric for creating this sort of more objective process for selecting participants, you're very likely to lose a point on that section. And the scoring rubric should just say, you get 5 points for being first gen, you get 5 points for being low income, you get 5 points for being, having disability, you get X number of points for GPA, right? So you're just creating some kind of point system so that you have an objective admission process so you can reduce, bias or, any other reasons for why you might be, selecting participants. And I think just as a program, just from a programmatic perspective, it's really important because if you end up denying a student for particular reasons, it's good to have sort of a record for why you made that decision in case you need to address that with the students or an advisor or mentor, or, I know you're not necessarily supposed to disclose personal things to parents, but maybe, you might end up talking to a parent at some point. And so I think it's just good to have that, on record anyways. But I've seen lots of people lose points for not having that. All right. Any questions about the plan of operation? I think the plan is the most straightforward part because it's just how are you going to run your program from the moment you get it until, your students, graduate and are going out into their careers or transferring. But happy to field any questions on the plan of operation. The applicant or, it's called the institutional support or the applicant support. And this is where you're going to talk about where your program will be housed on your campus, what kind of facilities and equipment and supplies will be provided in kind to from the institution to your program, what kind of personnel on your campus, and what kind of time will they contribute to the grant, just again, in kind, not being paid to do so. What kind of retention policies do you already have in place to ensure that students are going to be retained on campus? And they also ask you to talk about what kind, how is your institution positioned to minimize the student debt load? And then finally, they want these are the 4 sections of your commitment. Section D is cooperation of the financial aid office, admissions office, registrar, and any data team that you have on campus. So your applicant commitment has to include these things. The strength of your proposal is in the amount of contributions your institution can provide, as well as the policies that are in place to specifically help the population would be eligible for your program. I would use tables where possible here to reduce the text and space. You are required to get signed letters of commitment. Although the letters are not included in your grant application, you're supposed to keep them on file. So if you have stated cooperation of these offices, you should have a letter saying that, or at least a letter from someone in a position to be able to say that these offices will cooperate, even if it's not each individual office. So maybe a provost or, someone, maybe the president would be a good letter as well. Definitely you need letters of support for all these, facilities, equipment, supplies, those kinds of things. I always recommend people to work on this section and the need section first before you start working on other sections. And the reason is because you need to secure these commitments, right? You need to speak to people on your campus. You need to get these letters of support, and you don't want to be holding up your grant by waiting on these commitments. And so I think it'd be good to work together as a team to come up with all of your wish lists, right? What are the things we really want our institution to commit to us? And get that wish list started to get checked off on and letters of commitment for those things. If you've never had access to your data system or financial aid system, or, if there's access you need on campus, now is a good time to ask for it, right? Anything that you need, you should ask now. Once that commitment is listed in your grant application, including financial commitments, it's expected that those financial and in-kind commitments will be committed for all 5 years of the grant. If your institution's providing financial support, they can't just do that, for the first year, because, the thought is that your grant is being funded based on the support that you're receiving. And they don't want institutions to front load a ton of support just to get funded, and then they take that support away the next 4 years. Because that's disingenuous in terms of the support being provided for a reader to determine that this is a quality application. So it's expected that you're going to have that support for all 5 years. Next section, quality of personnel. This is the easiest section, but people do lose points here. There are 3 sections. What are the minimum qualifications for the director? What are the minimum qualifications for the other staff working in the program? And a plan to employ someone who has overcome similar obstacles as your participants. This is minimum requirements, not the actual people in those positions. And I can't stress that enough, because many of the clients I work with will write very robust descriptions of their director, because that's who's currently in the position. Then that person leaves and they find it almost impossible to replace them. And the reason why it's almost impossible to replace them is because the Department of Education has to approve the hiring of any new director. And if that new director does not have the qualifications outlined in your grant application, they will deny you from hiring that person. And so it's important that you only talk about the minimum qualifications needed to hire anybody in these positions. All right. I would take into account the difficulty it may be in hiring somebody in positions with very high qualifications in your area. Let's say you live in a very rural area, or your institution doesn't pay very well for directors, or whatever it might be. You should not be asking for, master's, PhD with 20 years of experience and, all of those things that, that you may be wanting to write for director. Keep it minimum. They could have a bachelor's degree required with a master's degree preferred. It could be anywhere from, let's say, 3 to 5 years of experience. You could put grant management, but I would be very careful about putting specifically TRIO grants management experience, because they will hold you to those kinds of things as well. So in general, just be careful about creating qualifications that are unreasonable for hiring people on your campus. All right. And I'm seeing this more and more and more post-pandemic. Institutions are having a very hard time hiring for positions. And so now's the time to reduce some of those qualifications in your grant. And again, I can help you figure out how minimum to be. You don't want to water it down so much that you won't earn the points either. And so there's some sweet spot there. Number 3, the plan to employ someone. Look at these words carefully. They actually want you to have a plan to employ someone with similar obstacles, not just creating equity, not advertising, not making sure people get interviews. They want you to go out and find someone who has a history of overcoming similar obstacles as your participants, a plan to employ them, right? Not just giving people an opportunity to get an interview. And so you can lose points here if you don't make it look like a plan that you really are trying to hire this person that has overcome similar obstacles. Okay. I've got some tips and things to help my clients with doing that. But for here on this webinar, I just want you to understand that it really is a plan to employ them. All right. That's different. The budget. I think if you've been managing your grants, these budget sections look, these categories looked, fairly normal. Almost any budget will include these kinds of things. So I'm going to go right to tips and overview. This is a first-year budget only. You're not including a 5-year budget. You're only using 1 year in your grant application and only 1 year on the SF 424 form that you're going to have to fill out in the grants.gov workspace. So tell your budget office, tell everybody it's 1 year only, and you can find that in the application instructions. Every competition, I have to have a discussion with the grants office or budget office about this, because they're used to putting multiple years for all of them. And when you look at the forms, it actually gives you 5 or 6 years to put in there. And so it is only 1 year. If it's included in the plan or in your personnel section or competitive preference priorities, it should be reflected in your budget. I had an applicant lose a point because they talked about tutoring in their program, and they did not put a line item for paying tutors in their budget. And so the reader looked at that and said, you don't have any money allocated for tutors, yet you have a tutoring program. Turns out that person, it was a pre-college program, but they had volunteer tutors. They weren't paying anyone. But they should have said that somewhere in the application, that they were volunteers, or that there would not be any budget allocated to that because they were volunteers. And so that just tells you that the readers are looking for that sort of thing. And so make sure that if you're saying you're going to do something, you're going to take a college tour to a graduate school for your students. You know, if you're a 4-year school or if you're a 2-year transfer school, you want to take college tours for them, you should have that in your budget, some money to take a college tour. All right, as an example. The budget has to be reasonable, cost effective, and adequate. You should have not only the calculations, but the explanations of each line item. And the budget will be determined when the application instructions are finalized. In 2020, it was $253,000. We do expect it to be more than that because programs have received increases. So it could be anywhere from 260 to maybe 270 or 80,000 per year is what I'm kind of projecting. But again, we're not going to know that amount for a new applicant until the RFP comes out. If you're an existing applicant, you still need to look for the instructions to see what the maximum is you can write for. Sometimes they'll say you can only write for your FY 2024, you know, budget, or it'll say, you know, your what was on your existing GAN plus 3%, right? They could give you an increase as well. So it's important to look at the instructions on what the amount that you can write for is. I know I'm speeding through these last sections a little bit, but again, I'll share this with you, you know, and a lot of these things are fairly intuitive as well. Any questions about, Lisa has a question about budget or personnel maybe?
Yeah, hi, how are you? Thank you so much for this amazing opportunity to hear this. I'm actually a big program. We are funded to serve 618 students.
My goodness.
Yeah, in Puerto Rico. So we definitely are struggling. I've been asking these questions over and over again, and I just wanted your perspective on lowering our numbers. Everybody tells me no, so I'm expecting a no. So I just wanted to hear your opinion on that.
Well, I would say prior to the pandemic, probably the answer would be no, but I don't think I've worked with a single program this year that has not had a hard time meeting their numbers with recruiting. So we're in a different day and time. Students are less engaged than they've ever been before. It's hard to get them to get out of their dorms and their houses and do extracurricular activities. Hard, even if you recruit them, it's hard to get them to participate. It's always kind of been hard to get college kids to participate anyway, but it's even harder now. So, you know, that's something that I would not dismiss completely. You know, obviously it'd be based on your situation and also based on the application instructions. In the last RFP, I believe that they put in there that there was a cost per participant amount. And so you could seek to lower that amount. Obviously, it would lower your budget significantly as well, based on that cost per participant. But the department also does not like that. They want you to serve as many students as possible. So yeah, that's a maybe. Most 99% of the time we would just say don't do it. But things are different now. And so I would engage you in a conversation on how that would look. And I would wait till RFP comes out to see what the instructions say about doing that. And maybe even having a conversation with your you know, SSS division lead, or maybe your program officer, to just see how that would look as well. I would not dismiss it the way I would have 3 or 4 years ago.
Thank you so much for that. We also have an SSSD recently approved. So we're SSS regular and disability. So, and they didn't consider that when writing the previous 2 grants. So yeah, I should make my case for that, but I just wanted your opinion. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I would be prepared, you know, with the data, with information, with, you know, what is the justification for doing that in case you do end up talking to someone at the department level. But yeah, I would not make the decision until the RFP comes out and you read what it says in the budget section. Because they will likely have some instructions on that. So, okay. Any other questions? Yes, you're welcome, Liz. So the evaluation section. The evaluation, in the past, you know, evaluations were, hey, we're going to evaluate our success, and at the end of the year, we'll figure out if we did well or not. Now it's over the, you know, past few cycles, it's been, we also need to be able to track our progress towards meeting our objectives. We need to use qualitative and quantitative data. And we also use what's called formative and summative evaluation measures. Formative is how do you look at the data to evaluate your progress towards meeting an objective? And if you're not on pace to meeting an objective, how do you alter your program so that you can ensure that you will meet the objectives at the end? And then your summative data is what it sounds like. It's at the end of the year. What kind of data are you looking at to determine your effectiveness? Of course, also including your APR data. And they also ask for you to use baseline data to evaluate successful outcomes for each of the objectives. And so you're going to include that baseline data in your evaluation model. And then they also want you to use the evaluation results to make programmatic changes. And then, so that's just what I was talking about, your sort of formative stuff. It's like, we're not on track to meeting it, or we didn't meet it. What can we do now? What is our evaluation process for saying what changes need to be made in order to not miss our objectives again? All right, so this is your evaluation section. Some odds and ends. The page limit in 2020 was 65 pages. There are some formatting requirements, or actually the recommendations now. I should have changed that. There's a one-page abstract that's single-spaced, including your objectives. Include objectives and your CPPs in your abstract, meaning include your objective percentages that you've set and include that you will be addressing your competitive preference priorities in your abstract. Let me also back up to the 65 pages and formatting requirements. A few years ago, there were some upper bound programs that were dismissed or defunded because they didn't meet some formatting requirements. And the Secretary of Education at the time decided to do away with those requirements and make them only recommendations. That includes the page number, that includes spacing, that includes fonts. Anything that is a formatting is no longer a requirement. It is now, they are now recommendations. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, I've worked on grants that have gone well over the page limit. I've worked on grants that did not adhere to single spacing or double spacing certain sections, and they all got funded. And so I even worked on a grant that was several pages over the page limit that did get funded. So I can tell you that they are only recommendations. However, to the extent possible that you can adhere to these recommendations, I do encourage you to do so. But I'm saying this so that you don't stress about that. Don't email everyone asking, can I single space this? Can I double space these tables? You can do anything you want because they're just recommendations. Try to adhere to them. Don't let it stress you out. The table of contents is required, but does not count against your 65-page limit. There will be a submission process outlined in the instructions. I recommend, if your institution has not submitted a federal grant recently, to make sure that their SAM number is updated and that they have access to the workspace. That number has to be updated annually. There's an appeal process for unsuccessful applicants. I talked about that before. How that works is if you are not funded, but you've fallen within a range of the cutoff score, you will get a letter saying you are in this second funding slate, and you have 15 days to tell us if you want to appeal or not. The only way you can appeal or have a successful appeal is if the readers made a scoring error. They said that there was something missing, which actually there it is on page 25. The reader said it wasn't there, but it is here. Or the reader said the readers deducted points for something that is not required for you to have in the first place, or they just added up your points wrong, or they added up your prior experience points wrong. Those are the only ways you can appeal. You can't just appeal because the reader said this section was not strong enough, I deducted a point. If it's their personal opinion that your objective is not ambitious enough, you cannot appeal that. That is not considered to be a mistake on the reader's behalf. If you are granted an appeal, you do not get those points added to your score. They actually rescore your entire application. So you could get a totally different score the second time. In fact, you could actually get a lower score as well. And then there's a location for all the documents in the RFP. They'll tell you where everything goes. The narrative will go in a separate spot. The competitive preference priorities will go in a separate spot. Abstract, GEP, all these things. There'll be instructions on where to put everything. So look for those instructions. If you have a grants office doing it all, they probably already know all of this stuff. All right. One of the last things we'll talk about is with SSS programs, you are allowed to give grant aid to students. And the regulations are outlined like this. They say that they have to be students in their first 2 years who are also Pell Grant recipients. They could be students who have completed their first 2 years if you can demonstrate that those students have a high risk of dropping out and that you first met the needs of the eligible first and second year students. The grant aid could not exceed 20% of your total budget and must come with a 33% match from your institution. So if you've not given grant aid before, you could consider it now. If you're writing a new grant, I just wanted to make you aware that you can provide grant aid to your students. Ivana, good question. The competitive preference priorities. I will talk about that in 1 second. Don't let me forget. Actually, let me just do it now since I'm done with grant aid before I get into this last part. So the competitive preference priorities will be listed as optional in your application. They are not optional. You must write them because if you don't earn those points, you're at a disadvantage in the competition. So while they are optional, if you don't write for them, you don't get the points and other people will. And that can be anywhere up to several points, right? Anywhere from like maybe 6 to like 10 points potentially, depending on the competition. You don't want to go into the competition missing several points. You just will not be competitive. So while they say they're optional, they're really not optional. And so, yeah, it definitely makes your application stronger to write them. You'll have a very hard time getting funded if you don't write for them. Some frequent questions, I can provide answers to these again offline as your consultant, any other thing. Does the need data show enough need? Is our eligible population, is the gap big enough between eligible and non-eligible? That's always a question. Are we setting the proper baselines here, right? We've come up with a data set. You ask your institutional research team for data. You just get the data and you just plop it into your grant application. That's a sure way to miss points. You really need to analyze it. You need to say, are we asking the right questions? Are we presenting the right data? And so we can help you do that. Are my objectives too high or too low? That question was answered, was asked earlier today. That's the most common question we get. Do I consider past performance? I think I mentioned that also today already. Is my selection process appropriate? If you don't have a scoring rubric, probably not. How long should the plan be? Some people think that you should include the number of page numbers that corresponds to the number of points that you're going to earn for that section. I'm not in that camp. I don't believe you should always correspond the number of pages of every section to the number of points you get. I'm in the camp of you need to answer the question that's being asked in order to earn the points. If you can do that in 2 pages instead of 10, it should be 2 pages, right? And so there really is no, in my opinion, there's no sort of page limit as it corresponds to the number of points. You just need to meet the selection criteria, and you need to do it in a very clear, succinct way so the readers can give you the points. Can we change staffing? Yes. Now that you're going to be resubmitting a new grant, or you're renewing your grant for another 5 years, now's the time to change anything you want in your application. You can change everything in this next application. Your staffing, your plan of operation, your objectives absolutely will change because the data will change, your budget can change, your line items, how you allocate money, all of that can be different. This grant application will be considered a brand new grant. While you have the grant already, if you're an existing applicant and you're applying for 5 more years, it's not seen as a continuation grant. It's seen as a brand new grant. And so you can write it completely different, although you are eligible for prior experience points still. Can a director be less than 100%? Yes, you can actually, the federal regulations say that you can direct up to 1 or 2 additional programs that serve similar students or similar populations. And so you could direct up to 3 grants without getting any additional, having to ask for permission from the department. So you can do up to 33% for each one on average. And that may come into play if you're applying, if you have an existing grant and you're applying for a new one. your new, in your new application, you may ask for a 50% director. You don't want to do that in your existing application, because if you don't get the new one funded, you still want to be 100%. So you don't want to go down to 50%. You can change that time and effort after you're funded. Changes after the grant is approved. That's what I was talking about. If you're 100% now and you write a new one at 50% and it's funded, you can then ask to get your existing time and effort on the existing grant down to 50%, so you can be the director of both programs. You can do that post-award, and that's what you should do. And then the last one, can you help with submission? Yes, we also provide technical support on the submission process. In fact, we've had institutions ask us to fill out their entire workspace and help them submit their entire grant. So in addition to help write grants and edit them and review them, we also provide submission assistance as well. Do not take that part for granted, especially if you do not have a robust grants office submitting this for you. That submission process is tedious. There are a lot of forms to fill out. There's a lot of instructions. It can be very stressful. Do not wait till the day before it's due to work on this stuff. It's a parallel track with your grant application to fill this stuff out. And again, it's usually not even open to start working on it until the final RFP is published in the Federal Register and in grants.gov. So you usually can't even get a jump start on it until they open it in grants.gov. So I know we're a couple minutes over, but I think we started a little bit late, and I'm long-winded. But if there are any additional questions, I'm happy to stay on and answer them. But that was the formal part of the presentation. So again, I'll open the floor up now to any questions that you have. And again, I'll send the evaluation to you as well. Yes, absolutely, Gina. Thank you all for coming.
I got a question.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So I know you mentioned earlier, if we're already an existing grant and we potentially want to write for a new grant. So how does that, because you said you could write for both, do you write for both inside of one proposal?
No, there would be separate
It'd be
submissions.
two separate submissions. Okay, so I'd have to do my regular SSS grant as it is right now. And if I wanted to write for an SSS STEM grant, that would be a separate.
Correct.
Okay.
And you want it to be separate anyways, because your existing grant, you qualify for prior experience points added to your grant score. The new application, you will not have prior experience added.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
And are you familiar with prior experience? I don't want to assume that everyone knows what that is.
No, you get those from, if I'm correct, you get those from any points like on your APR for like your objectives, like retention, good standing, meeting those, correct?
Mm-hmm.
For years 2, 3, and 4. Years
That's
1 and
exactly
5
right.
don't
Mhm.
count.
Yep. They take the average of years 2, 3, and 4. Yep.
Oh.
And so your new application will not receive those. So you're competing against other people who will get those, including yourself. There's not a separate competition for those special populations. They're all in the same competition.
I didn't realize that. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, I thought that was important. So like if you want to write a STEM SSS grant, there's not a separate competition just for SSS STEM applicants, and they're going to fund a bunch of them. All of the 6 populations, if they have all 6 again, will all be in the same competition competing against each other.
Oh my good word.
Yeah,
Wow.
I mean, it's the same grant, right? The selection criteria, everything's the same. You're just proposing to serve a very specific population, but you have the same required services, everything's the same. And again, they're not even required to host special populations. It's not outlined in the regulations, so they don't even have to do that.
Gotcha.
Except for the fact that there are existing applicants now who already have those programs.
Okay. Makes sense. Okay.
Mhm.
And last question that I have, and I will hop off. As far as the potential technical service, the things that you all provide, we would just email you at the email that you provided at the end of the webinar today.
So I put it in the chat box, my email address, but it's just heath@studysmarttutors.com. We're always taking on partners to work with them on their grants. We've already taking on a few. In the last SSS competition, we worked on either writing or reviewing or commenting on almost 50 SSS grant applications. So we'll have plenty of space. And again, it's not due until next year, so we've got plenty of time to work on it also.
I'm simultaneously writing my dissertation, so anything that I can do early in life works for me.
Yeah, well, there's two things. Sometimes it's bandwidth, sometimes it's expertise. A lot of time it's peace of mind, right? Like people they really like to hire us to give them the peace of mind that what they have in their application is going to be funded. And we've done a pretty good job. We've never had an existing applicant lose a grant ever. So we feel pretty confident we can get, people refunded. Some institutions will not allow their SSS team to write the grant. They always hire someone or their grants office will write it. You're not allowed to pay out of your grant budget to hire someone to help you write the grant. So it has to be institutional funds. So there's a whole lot of rules around it, which we can also help you with.
Yeah, that part I knew as far as, you can't use the grant funds, has to be institutional, and the expectation is I am going to write this. So yeah, I think for me, it would be more so just like a peace of mind. I came into the position when the last grant competition was already done with. So like I have the grant from last year, but already being on 2 webinars, I can see where some of the things I'm like, why would you give them this? That doesn't look like something you'd want to get. It just from listening to you talk, I'm like, okay, no, I'm not replicating that again. We're gonna do something different. So okay.
Yeah, definitely. It is worth having someone look it over who understands the selection criteria. Whether you pay someone or you have a friend or whatever, it's really worth having someone look at it, especially if you've not done it before. I see institutions lose their grants all the time because someone who never wrote it before in the grants office took some liberties and wrote a bunch of stuff and it was not correct, and they just they messed up their grants. And so I hate to see people lose a grant. You can keep these forever, especially if you have prior experience points. So it's always helpful to find an expert who can at least look over something for you.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you so much for today's webinar. I'm gonna hop off now.
Thanks everyone for joining again. I'll do a follow-up. I'll send out a bunch of stuff to you guys after this is over, including the evaluation. I really appreciate you all being here, and best wishes on the upcoming competition. Take care, guys.